The morning they came to her door, the snow had just stopped falling. It lay across the valley in long, unbroken silence, white and deep and indifferent, the way only wilderness can be indifferent. 5 men stood at the entrance of a cave carved into red sandstone, their breath rising in small clouds that dissolved before they reached the sky. Their hands were wrapped in rags. Their lips had lost their color. One of them could not stop shaking, even though the wind had gone still hours ago. They knocked 3 times, quiet, almost apologetic. The knock of men who understood, somewhere beneath their pride, that they had no right to knock at all. Inside, a woman rose from beside the fire. She moved without hurry. She had learned, over the long months in that carved-out place, that hurry was a kind of fear. And she had used up most of her fear in the first weeks, in the dark, when there had been nothing left but a child pressed against her side and the faint warmth of stone that remembered better days. She lifted the bar from the door, pulled it open. The cold came in first, then the light, then their faces. She knew every one of them. The man with the ruined hands who had laughed the loudest. The rancher who had stood before the whole congregation and called her grief a kind of madness. The doctor with his careful words and his diploma and his absolute certainty that a woman who read caterpillars and beaver dams could not possibly know more than he did. And behind them, 2 others, neighbors who had not spoken against her, had simply looked away, which in the end had amounted to the same thing. She looked at them for a long moment. Then she stepped aside. "Come in," she said. "Get warm." But that is not where the story begins. The story begins weeks before, on a night that smelled of candle wax and old wood and the particular shame of a room full of people who have already decided what they believe. Eleanor Voss stood alone at the front of the church, her hands folded in front of her, her back straight. She was 38 years old. She had been a widow for 2 years. She had the kind of face that had once been called pretty in a soft, unassuming way. But grief and weather and the long labor of surviving had changed it into something quieter and more permanent. Something that did not ask for approval. She had been speaking for several minutes. No one was listening. "The beaver dams on the North Creek," she said, "are 3 feet higher than any year I can remember. The geese flew south a full month early. The woolly bears are nearly solid black, every one of them. My father taught me to read these signs before I was old enough to read words." She paused. Let the silence hold for just a moment. He was never wrong. From the front pew, Reverend Corbin Ashby regarded her with an expression that managed to be both kind and dismissive at once. The expression of a man who has confused patience with wisdom for so long he can no longer tell them apart. He was a tall man, silver-haired, with a voice built for large rooms. He had led this community for 20 years. He had never, in that time, been seriously challenged by anyone, certainly not by a widow, Eleanor. His voice was warm, almost gentle. "You have endured a great deal these past 2 years. We all understand that. But fear is not evidence, and grief." He paused, choosing his words with the care of a man who believes his words carry special weight. Grief can make the world seem darker than it is. From beside the pulpit, Dr. Pemberton Gale adjusted his spectacles and added his voice to the room. He cited barometric patterns. He cited historical records. He used words that most people in the room did not fully understand, which was precisely the point. Understanding was not required. Authority was. In the back row, Harland Beecham, the largest landowner for 30 miles, laughed outright. Not a cruel laugh exactly. The laugh of a man who finds something ridiculous and sees no reason to pretend otherwise. "Ma'am," he said, "with respect, my cattle are fat and healthy, and my barns are full. I'll take my chances with your caterpillars." More laughter, scattered but real. Eleanor did not flinch. She had her father's eyes, steady and gray, the color of riverstone, and she kept them level as the room made its decision without her. She looked at each face in turn. Some looked away. Some held her gaze with the blank, comfortable certainty of people who have never been wrong about anything important. One face did not join in. Martha Ashby sat in the front row, 3 feet from her husband's pulpit, her hands folded in her lap. She was looking at the floor, but her jaw was tight, the tightness of a woman holding something in that very much wanted to come out. Eleanor noticed. She would remember. The vote was not close. Afterward, in the narrow hallway outside the church, Eleanor stood in the cold and did not move for a moment. The sound of voices inside, relieved, returning to normal, drifted through the wooden walls like something she was no longer part of. She had known this was possible. She had come anyway, because her father had taught her that staying silent when you know the truth is just another form of lying. She had spoken. They had not listened. Now she had to decide what to do next. A hand caught her arm. Old Obadiah Whitfield, 72 years old, leaning on his walking stick, his face a map of winters that most people in that town had never lived through, looked at her with eyes that held no pity and no apology. Just recognition. The recognition of someone who has been exactly where she was standing and knows what comes after. "Go north," he said. His voice was barely above a breath. "Red sandstone cliffs where the creek splits. Your father knew that ground." He did not explain how he knew her father. He did not explain why he was helping. He simply held her gaze for one long moment, then turned and walked back inside. Before she reached the road, something pressed into her palm. A hunting knife, old and well kept, the handle worn smooth by generations of use. Ridley Crane, 17 years old, son of one of the larger ranches, stood before her with his jaw set and his eyes bright with something that looked almost like fury. He didn't speak, just pressed the knife into her hand, held her gaze, and nodded once. Then he was gone. Eleanor walked home through the dark. Toby was asleep when she arrived, 9 years old, curled on his side, one hand stretched out across the empty space where his father used to sleep. She stood in the doorway and watched him breathe. She had a knife, a warning, and a direction. She had everything her father had ever taught her. She had enough. By the following morning, they were gone. The sandstone cliffs appeared on the second day of walking, rising from the frozen earth like something that had been waiting, red and vast and ancient, carved by forces so slow and enormous that human urgency seemed almost beside the point. A crack in the rock face, sheltered beneath a deep overhang, dark inside, cold. The walls black with old smoke from fires that had burned there long before Eleanor or her father or anyone she had ever known. Toby stood beside her and looked up. "Can we really live here?" he asked. Eleanor placed her hand against the stone, felt the rough surface, the deep cold, and beneath it, something else, a potential, the same thing her father had pointed to years ago, in a different cliff face, in a different season, when she was small enough to believe that everything her father said was simply true. "Your grandfather taught me something," she said. "He said stone remembers warmth. Every fire you build in a place like this, the rock holds it, keeps it, gives it back to you long after the flames are gone." She looked at her son. "We're going to build a lot of fires." Toby looked at the cave, at his mother, at the knife on her belt and the set of her shoulders, and the particular stillness in her face that he had learned over 9 years meant she had already decided. "Okay," he said, and they went inside. The first morning inside the cave, Eleanor did not rest. She stood at the entrance before the sun had fully cleared the ridge and studied what she had. The overhang above was deep enough to keep snow off the door, if she built one. The crack in the ceiling near the back was narrow enough to draw smoke upward without flooding the space. The floor was uneven, layered with old debris, but beneath the rubble, the stone was solid. Her father had taught her to see past what a place was and into what it could become. A seed does not look like a tree. A crack in a cliff does not look like a home. Not until someone with enough knowledge and enough will decides to make it one. Toby woke an hour after her and found his mother already working. He did not ask questions. He picked up a stone and began doing what she was doing, clearing the floor, stacking the rubble near the entrance, moving with the quiet focus of a child who has learned that action is sometimes the only answer to fear that makes any sense. They worked side by side through the morning without speaking much, and the silence between them was not empty. It was the silence of two people who understand each other well enough not to need words. By midday, the floor was clear. By late afternoon, Eleanor had mapped the walls with her hands. Every seam, every layer, every place where the sandstone wanted to give way. Her father's voice moved through her memory like water through familiar ground. "Never fight the rock, Ellie. Stone has its own mind. Find the lines. Work with them. Let the rock tell you where it wants to come apart." She found the lines. She gathered harder stones from the valley floor, pieces of quartzite and dense granite that had tumbled down from the heights in some ancient season, and shaped them against each other until she had something that would serve as a chisel. A flat-topped stone fit her palm and could work as a hammer. She positioned her makeshift tool along a natural seam in the wall and struck. A slab of sandstone the size of her forearm fell away. Toby looked up from where he was sorting firewood. "It worked," he said. "It always works," Eleanor said. "If you find the right line." She repositioned, struck again. Another slab. The rock was not her enemy. It never had been. The rock was her partner. Patient and honest and entirely indifferent to her opinion of it, which was exactly what she needed right now. She had enough people in her life who formed opinions. What she needed was something that simply told the truth. The days that followed settled into a rhythm as steady as breathing. Dawn to midday. Carve. Expand the main chamber inch by inch, smoothing the walls, deepening the fire pit, shaping small alcoves in the rock where supplies could be stored and protected from damp. Eleanor's hands became a map of damage, blisters forming and breaking and forming again, the skin beneath growing tougher with each passing layer, as though her body understood that softness was a luxury the season had withdrawn. Midday to late afternoon. Gather. She checked the snare lines she laid each morning along the rabbit runs that threaded through the valley floor. Thin paths worn into the undergrowth by small animals moving the same routes over and over, generation after generation, until the trails were written into the earth itself. Her father had taught her to read those trails the way other people read sentences. She gathered pine nuts from the trees, rose hips from the wild bushes along the creek, roots and tubers from the frozen ground, digging until her fingers ached and then digging a little more. Late afternoon to dark, process and store, scrape hides, salt meat, stack wood in the precise rows her father had insisted upon, not for the sake of order, but because in deep winter, when your hands were too cold and too clumsy to search, you needed to know exactly where everything was without looking. And Toby was there for all of it. He was 9 years old, and he carried his grief the way children carry heavy things, not by putting it down, but by finding ways to move with it that didn't look like struggling. He talked less than he used to. He had been a talkative child once, full of questions, the kind of boy who narrated the world back to himself as he moved through it. Since Edmund died, something in him had gone quieter. Not broken, quieter. But he watched everything Eleanor did with those careful, serious eyes. And he learned. She showed him how to feel for the seams in the stone. He found one on his own, on the 4th day, and struck it correctly on the first try. Eleanor said nothing, just nodded. The small, precise nod her father had given her when she got something right. Toby understood what the nod meant without being told. She showed him how to set a snare along a rabbit run, the angle of the loop, the height from the ground, the way to anchor it so the movement of the catch pulled the cord tight rather than loose. He set 3 on his own the next morning. 2 of them worked. She showed him how to read the smoke rising from their fire, the way it moved, the direction it pulled, what that told them about the weather forming beyond the ridge. He sat beside her in the evenings and watched the smoke with the same stillness she had learned from her father. The attention of someone who understands that the world is always speaking, and the only question is whether you are listening. They were not comfortable. Comfort was not the point, but they were building something, and building has its own warmth, a warmth that has nothing to do with temperature. On the 8th day, Eleanor found the wolf. She had gone down to the creek before dawn to check the lower snare line, moving through the dark with the ease of someone who has learned to navigate by sound and instinct rather than sight. The wolf was lying near the water's edge. A female, gray-coated, the fur along her left side matted dark with blood. She had been in a fight, a bad one. The kind that happens inside a pack when power shifts and someone loses and the rest move on, because packs cannot afford to carry what cannot keep up. Eleanor stood 10 feet away and looked at her. The wolf looked back. No aggression, no plea. Just the flat, exhausted regard of a creature that has accepted its situation and is waiting for whatever comes next. Eleanor had the knife on her belt. The wolf was injured, slowed, an easy thing. The hide would provide warmth. The meat would last several days. Every calculation her circumstances demanded pointed in a single direction. She reached for the knife. Then Toby's voice came from just behind her. He had followed, silent as snow. "Ma." A pause. "She's like us." Her pack left her behind. Eleanor's hand stilled on the handle. 8 words. And in them, everything her son had not said in months. Every quiet morning. Every careful evening. Every night she had heard him turn in his sleep and whisper something into the dark that she couldn't quite make out. All of it, compressed into 8 words, about a wolf that neither of them should have had the energy to care about. She took her hand away from the knife. From the pack on her back, she pulled a strip of cloth, torn from the lining of Edmund's old coat, the coat she had brought because she could not make herself leave it behind, the coat that still held, in some deep fiber of the wool, something that might have been his warmth, or might have been only her memory of it. She had been carrying it for weeks. She had told herself it was practical, extra material, useful for binding and wrapping, and the 100 small repairs that survival required. She had known, even as she told herself this, that it was not entirely true. She knelt beside the wolf. The animal growled once, low, reflexive, the warning of something that has very little left but is not ready to surrender it. Eleanor moved slowly. She cleaned the wound with creek water, cold and clear. She packed it with a compress of moss and dried herbs she'd been gathering since the first week. The same mixture her father had used on his own injuries in the field, passed to her not as medicine but as common sense, the way all real knowledge is passed. And then she wrapped the wolf's side with strips of Edmund's coat lining, binding the compress in place with the careful attention of someone who understands that small things done correctly are never actually small. This was not only practical. This was the moment Eleanor truly let go, not of Edmund's memory, which she would carry always, but of the fear that she could not stand without him. She had used his coat to carry grief. Now she used it to carry something forward instead. The wolf tracked her hands the entire time with those yellow eyes, watching, not hunting. There is a difference, and only another predator would recognize it. When it was done, Eleanor rose and stepped back. The wolf lay still for a long moment. Then, with enormous effort, it rolled upright, stood on unsteady legs, and limped toward the tree line. At the edge of the forest, it stopped, turned its head, looked back at Eleanor and Toby for one long suspended moment across the snow. Then it was gone. Toby stood beside his mother in the cold, watching the tree line. "Do you think she'll be okay?" he asked. "I don't know," Eleanor said, "but she has a chance now. She didn't before." Toby thought about this. "Is that enough?" Eleanor looked down at him, at the serious face, the careful eyes, the small figure standing straight in the cold, as though straightness were something he had decided on rather than something that came naturally. "Sometimes," she said, "a chance is everything." 9 days after they arrived at the cliffs, Ghost appeared. He came at dawn, moving out of the mist that rose from the creek each morning. A horse the color of winter sky, pale gray shading toward silver in the early light, his mane tangled with burrs, his right rear leg carried with the careful, compensating gait of an animal in significant pain. His ribs showed. His eyes held the wariness of a creature that had learned, probably more than once, that trust was expensive. He stood near the spring and drank with the desperate focus of something that has gone without water too long. Toby saw him first and went completely still. The stillness he had been practicing since they arrived, the stillness Eleanor had been trying to teach him for years without quite finding the words for it. He had found the words himself, or rather, found the silence beneath the words, which is the harder thing. "Ma," he said, barely above a whisper, "I see him. A horse changed everything. A horse could carry what 2 people could not. A horse could cover distance that would take days on foot. But a wild horse, a horse that had survived alone and learned to trust nothing, could not be rushed or forced or persuaded by need alone. Eleanor had learned this from her father, who had spent 3 days once bringing a frightened mare close enough to touch, sitting on a rock in the cold, with nothing but patience and a handful of dried grass. She told Toby, "We do not go to him. We let him come to us." Day 1. They sat at the edge of the valley, visible but distant, and did nothing. The horse watched them over the rim of the creek bank with ears swiveling like small instruments measuring the frequency of threat. He did not run. That was enough for day 1. Day 2. Eleanor left a small pile of dried grass on a flat rock 15 feet closer than where they had sat. Then they retreated. An hour later, the horse crossed to the rock and ate. He looked at the space where they had been with something that was not yet curiosity, but was no longer pure alarm. Day 3 through 8. Closer. More grass. More stillness. More of the slow, patient accumulation of evidence that these two creatures, this woman, this boy, were not a danger. Were, in fact, something worth approaching. On the 9th morning, Ghost walked to Eleanor on his own. He extended his muzzle and breathed against her outstretched hand. Warm breath against cold skin. The sensation of something choosing trust after a long time without it. Eleanor stayed absolutely still. She felt his heartbeat through the soft skin of his nose, fast and weary, but present. "We're the same," she said quietly. "Left behind, but still here." Toby reached up slowly and laid his palm against the horse's neck. Ghost turned his great head and regarded the boy with one dark, liquid eye. Something passed between them. The recognition, perhaps, of two young things who had lost something and were still in the process of deciding what to do about that. Two beings learning, in their different ways, that the world had not ended simply because it had changed beyond recognition. That evening, Ghost followed them into the cave. The second chamber Eleanor had carved, intended for storage, became his stable. And the heat of his body, steady and enormous, moved through the connected space like a second fire. Eleanor lay that night, listening to the slow, rhythmic sound of the horse breathing in the dark, and she thought, "We are going to be all right." Not because the danger had passed. It hadn't. Not because the work was done. It wasn't. But because the cave was warm, and her son was sleeping, and a horse that had been abandoned by everything it knew had chosen to come inside. Some things cannot be argued with. The storm came on the last night of that first week. Not the killing winter Eleanor had been preparing for. Not yet. This was a messenger. A warning sent ahead of what was coming, to test what had been built and what had not. The wind arrived first. It came down from the north without introduction, moving from stillness to violence in the space of a single breath. And it found every gap in Eleanor's unfinished door with the methodical thoroughness of something looking for a way in. The fire she had been tending all evening guttered. She added wood, banking it carefully. The wind found another gap. The fire guttered again. And then, in one sudden gust that hit the entrance like a fist, the flames went out. Not gradually, not with warning, simply light and then dark. The darkness was total. Eleanor had been in dark places before, caves and forests and the lightless hours between midnight and dawn. But this darkness had a quality she hadn't encountered, the darkness of a place where warmth had been and was now gone, which carries a cold that goes beyond temperature into something closer to dread. Toby was across the cave. She could hear him, his breathing going faster. "Ma, I'm here, don't move." She felt for the matches in her coat pocket, counted them by touch. 3. The wind pushed against the door. She could feel the temperature already beginning to drop, not dramatically, but steadily, the way cold works when it has decided to take something back. Toby made a small sound that he was trying not to make. Eleanor struck the first match. The wind, finding the same gap it had always found, snuffed it before the sulfur had fully caught. She struck the second. It flared, then died. She had cupped her hands around it, had turned her body to block the draft, had done everything correctly. And it died anyway, because correctness is not always enough. 1 match. She sat still for a moment in the dark with the last match in her fingers and the cold settling around her like water filling a space. And she thought about what her father had taught her about panic. Panic, he had said, is the decision to spend your remaining energy on fear rather than on the problem in front of you. He had said it quietly, the way he said everything that mattered, as though volume were a kind of waste. She pressed her free hand flat against the cave wall, and she felt it, faint, barely there, like the last warmth in a cup that has been sitting too long. The heat you find when you wrap your hands around it and are surprised to discover it hasn't gone entirely cold yet. The wall was warm, not comfortable, not even noticeably warm, but warm in the way that stone is warm when it has been absorbing heat for a long time and has stored it faithfully, the way only stone can store things without drama or announcement, simply because that is what stone does. Stone remembers warmth, her father's voice, clear as if he were standing beside her in the dark. Eleanor pressed her back against the wall, drew Toby to her, positioned him against the stone. The warmth was minimal. It would not save them from hours of exposure, but it bought time, and time was the only currency that mattered right now. She struck the last match. She had angled herself so her body was a complete windbreak. The match caught. The tinder she had laid in advance caught too, bone-dry pine shavings positioned precisely where she had put them, in the location she had chosen weeks ago, for exactly this kind of emergency. The fire breathed. The fire grew. Eleanor sat beside it with her son pressed against her side and her back against the warm stone. And she felt something move through her chest that was not quite relief and not quite grief. It was the sensation of a debt paid, of a man who had died before she was ready, who had nonetheless found a way to reach across the distance and be present when she needed him most. She had saved her son tonight with a sentence her father had spoken years ago beside a campfire in a different valley. Stone remembers warmth. She held Toby until his breathing slowed, until the shaking stopped, until the cave was warm enough that she could feel the cold retreating back through the gaps in the door to wait for another opportunity. And then she stayed there longer, not because it was necessary, but because she was not ready to move yet. Because some moments need to be sat with. "Ma," Toby said very quietly, from somewhere against her shoulder. "Yes? Are we going to be okay?" She looked at the fire, at the walls that had held their warmth like a promise kept, at the stacked wood, the stored provisions, the careful preparations of a woman who had been listening to the right things for long enough to know what they were saying. "Yes," she said, "we are." And she wept. Then, not from fear, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming, wordless gratitude of someone who has just understood, at a level below thought, how much she was loved by a man who had been gone for years and would never be entirely gone. Crisis 2, the threat of losing Toby. And then Ridley Crane came, He arrived on a night in the deep middle of autumn, when the cold had sharpened to the point where the air itself felt like a warning. Eleanor heard Ghost shift and blow before she heard anything else. The horse had become an alarm more reliable than any she could have built. She was at the door with the knife in her hand before the knock came. Ridley was 17, tall and lean, with the calloused hands of a boy who had worked cattle since before he was old enough to want to. He stood in the entrance, and his jaw was set tight, and his eyes held the look of someone carrying information they wished they didn't have. "I can't stay long," he said. "My father doesn't know I'm here." Eleanor stepped back and let him in. He told her quickly, in a low voice, not looking at Toby. Reverend Ashby had been speaking to the town council. He had been framing Eleanor's absence, the fact that she had taken her son and disappeared into the wilderness rather than accept the community's judgment, as evidence of instability, evidence of an unfit mother. There were men in the council, Ridley said, who were listening, who were talking about their legal responsibility to the welfare of children in the territory. "They're talking about Toby," Eleanor said. Ridley nodded. The silence that followed had weight and texture. Eleanor stood very still in the middle of her carved-out home. The stacked firewood, the hung meat, the neat rows of stored roots, the warmth radiating from the walls themselves, and felt the ground shift beneath her. This was not a threat to her survival. This was a threat to her reason for surviving. After Ridley left, Eleanor sat down beside the fire and did not move for a long time. She thought about what going back would mean. Finding someone in town willing to take them in. Keeping her head down. Saying nothing more about weather or warnings or the things her father had taught her. Toby warm. Toby fed. Toby safe from the danger of having a mother the town had decided was dangerous. She thought about Edmund, about the night he got sick, how quickly it had moved, how little any of them could do, how she had sat beside him until the end holding his hand and talking to him, even after she wasn't sure he could hear her anymore, because she didn't know what else to do, and doing nothing felt unbearable. She thought about her father, about the way he had moved through the world, quietly, without argument, guided by knowledge so deep it had become instinct. He had never sought anyone's approval. He had simply done what he understood to be true, and let the results speak. She sat with all of this until the fire burned low. Then a sound from across the cave, small, specific. Toby, shifting in his sleep. He rolled onto his back and one hand reached out, the way it always did, searching for the absence where Edmund used to be. His fingers found Ghost's leg instead. The horse had moved close in the night, the way animals do when they sense something unsettled in the air. And Toby's hand curled around it without waking, and he went still again. Eleanor watched this. She felt something move through her chest. Not quite pain, not quite relief. Something that lived between the two. The recognition that she was not, in fact, alone. That she was held by things she had not arranged. Things that had simply arrived because she had left the door open for them. She rose quietly, moved to where Toby slept and crouched beside him, just looking. At his face in the firelight, the features that were Edmund's and the ones that were hers, and the ones that had arrived from somewhere neither of them had ever been. Then she heard him murmur, still mostly asleep, "Ma, are we poor?" She looked around the cave, the neatly stacked wood, the provisions hanging from wooden pegs she had hammered into the rock herself, the warmth in the walls that answered every fire she fed them. ghost standing in the doorway of his chamber, like something placed there deliberately. Her son, sleeping with one hand around a horse's leg, dreaming in safety in a place that had been nothing when they arrived. "No, sweetheart," she said softly. "We are rich in what matters." Toby made a small sound and was gone back into sleep. Eleanor stayed beside him for another moment. Then she rose, moved to the back wall, and pressed both palms flat against the stone, closed her eyes, felt the warmth the rock had absorbed from weeks of fire. Patient, stored, faithful. Stone remembers warmth. She would not go back. She would stay. And she would prepare not just for 2 people, but for more. She would carve additional chambers in the nearby rock formations. She would gather more than 2 people needed. She would lay in provisions for a number she could not yet name, against a disaster she could feel building in every living thing in that valley. Because whatever those people had done to her and Toby, she could not make herself into someone who let them freeze. Her father would not have, and she was his daughter. She would not be the winter. She went back to work. Back in town, Martha Ashby moved through her days with the careful precision of a woman who has learned to make herself invisible in her own home. She cooked. She cleaned. She sat in the front pew on Sundays and nodded at the right moments and said the appropriate things to the appropriate people. She was the Reverend's wife. She had been performing this role for so long that she sometimes forgot, in the middle of an ordinary afternoon, that performing it was what she was doing. But something had changed since the night of the vote. She had started putting things aside. It began small. A little extra flour, tucked behind the good dishes no one ever used. A tin of preserves, slipped to the back of the pantry shelf. A paper bag of dried beans, wrapped in cloth and placed beneath the winter blankets in the cedar chest. Small things. A little more each week. She could not have explained why. She only knew that when she closed her eyes at night, she saw a woman standing at the front of a church. Straight-backed, steady-voiced, saying what she believed to be true in front of people who had already decided not to hear it. And she saw herself in the front pew looking at the floor. So she put things aside, not toward any clear destination, only because it was the one action available to her that felt, in the deep quiet of her conscience, like something other than nothing. Outside, the animals moved with increasing urgency through the shortening days. The squirrels gathered with a franticness that went beyond ordinary preparation. The birds had long since gone. The elk came down from the high country in numbers and with a speed that made the old-timers uneasy, though none of them said so in town. The creek ran low and then froze earlier than any of them could remember, which should have meant something to someone, but the barns were full and the harvest had been good, and it is very hard to be afraid when everything in your visible world says that there is nothing to fear. Eleanor watched all of it from the cliffs. She watched and she worked and she stored and she built. She did not pray for them to believe her. She had moved past that. She simply prepared. And the mountain watched with her, patient and old and utterly certain of what was coming. The way mountains always are. The way all large and honest things are certain. When the evidence has been accumulating long enough for anyone paying attention to read. The question was never what was coming. The question was only who would be ready when it arrived. The boy arrived at dusk. He was perhaps 14, bundled in a coat too large for his frame, moving through the failing light with the urgent, slightly panicked gait of someone who had been told to hurry and understood why. Eleanor heard Ghost shift before she heard footsteps, the horse's ears swiveling forward, his great head lifting from the water trough she had carved into the rock. By the time the knock came, she was already at the door. The boy's name was Caleb Whitfield. He was Old Obe's great-nephew, and he had walked 4 miles through the cold to find her. He held out a folded piece of paper with both hands, as though the delivering of it were a formal and serious thing, which Eleanor understood it was. She took it. Read it by the light of the fire. The handwriting was unsteady. The hand of a man whose body was giving out while the mind inside it remained insistently, furiously clear. Old Obi had been bedridden for 2 weeks. His great-nephew had not told Eleanor this when he brought the first message, because Old Obi had told him not to. The old man had his reasons for everything, including his silences. The note was short. Prepare for 30. What is coming will be the worst this valley has seen in living memory. Do not wait for them to believe you. Prepare anyway. And then, below that, in letters slightly larger than the rest, as though he had pressed harder with the pen, your father saved my life when I was a child. I was 8 years old, lost in the snow, 3 days from the settlement. He found me by following the ravens. He carried me back on his back and never told a soul, because he said a man's hardest moments belonged to him and no one else. I have kept that silence for 60 years. But you should know, the knowledge he gave you is not only his. It is older than both of you. It has been saving lives longer than either of you have been alive. Now it is your turn to carry it forward. I am sorry I cannot do more. Eleanor read the note twice. Then she folded it carefully and placed it in the inner pocket of her coat, against her chest, where it would stay for the rest of the winter. She looked at Caleb Whitfield, standing in her doorway with his hands in his pockets and snow melting in his hair. How is he? She asked. The boy's jaw tightened in the way of someone trying to be older than they are. He says he's fine. He's not fine. Is he in pain? He says he isn't. A pause. He isn't telling the truth about that either. Eleanor nodded. She went to the storage alcove and packed a bundle. Dried meat, rose hip tea, a compress of herbs that eased inflammation, a small tin of rendered fat she used for everything from cooking to treating cracked skin. She pressed it into Caleb's arms. Tell him, she said, and then stopped, because what she wanted to say was too large for a doorway at dusk with a 14-year-old boy as the messenger. She started again. Tell him I understand now. Tell him I'll carry it. Caleb nodded gravely, the way young people nod when they are trusted with something they sense is important, even if they cannot fully name it. Then he turned and went back into the dark, and Eleanor stood in the entrance of the cave and watched him until the cold swallowed him completely. She went inside and sat down on the stone bench she had carved along the near wall, smooth now from weeks of use, shaped by the hours she had spent here thinking. Ghost moved close behind her. Toby was asleep. The fire breathed steadily in its pit. She had known this, in some unspoken way, from the beginning. She had known that the knowledge her father gave her was not hers alone, that it had passed through hands she would never see, through moments she would never know, accumulating value the way rivers accumulate water. Thomas Harrow had not invented the wisdom. He had received it and tended it and given it away freely, the way all real knowledge must be given to stay alive. And now old Obi, who had carried a 60-year secret, who had been the only person in that church to raise his hand against the tide, was telling her that the circle was longer and older than she had known, that her father had saved his life, that his survival had led, in ways neither of them could have mapped, to this: a woman in a cave in a high valley, carving space for 30 people, preparing for a storm no one else believed was coming. She was not the beginning of this story. She was somewhere in the middle, which meant there was still more to do. She went to work. The additional chambers took 6 days. There were natural formations in the rock to the east of her main cave, smaller pockets, expandable, connected by a narrow passage she had been mapping in her mind since the first week. She worked in the early morning and after dark, leaving the middle hours for gathering and storing. Her hands had long since stopped complaining. They had simply become what she needed them to be: instruments of intention, shaped by the work they were given. Toby worked beside her without being asked. He had grown in the weeks since they arrived at the cliffs. Not taller, or perhaps taller, she was too close to be sure, but in some other way that had to do with the set of his shoulders and the steadiness of his eyes. He was becoming someone. She could see it happening in real time, the way you can sometimes watch a plant unfurl if you sit still long enough. On the 4th day of carving the new chambers, he found a seam she had missed. He was working on the east wall, following the technique she had shown him, running his fingers along the surface, feeling for the slight depression that indicated a boundary between layers. He found one, positioned his chisel stone, and struck. A section of wall the length of his arm separated cleanly and fell to the floor. He looked at it, looked at her. "You missed one," he said, not triumphant, just informational. The tone of someone who has learned that accuracy matters more than victory. Eleanor looked at the clean break in the wall. "I did," she said. Toby turned back to the wall and kept working. She watched him for a moment. This 9-year-old boy with his father's hands and her father's patience, and thought, Thomas Harrow would have loved you so much. He would have taught you every word the world knows how to speak, and you would have listened. She turned back to her own wall and kept working. The warning no one heard. The morning she decided to go back to town came without announcement. Eleanor woke before dawn, lay still in the dark, listening to Ghost breathe, and Toby sleep and the wind moving over the cliff face above, and simply knew. The signs had been building for days, not dramatic, not sudden, but cumulative. The sky at sunset the previous evening had shifted toward a color she had no word for, something between gray and yellow, like a bruise forming from the inside out. The creek had gone completely silent, frozen solid overnight, earlier than any previous night. Ghost had not slept. He had stood in his chamber with his ears forward and his muscles tight, moving occasionally from one foot to the other with the restlessness of an animal that feels something in the air that has no visible source. And the birds. There were no birds. Not fewer than usual. None. The valley was entirely silent in a way that was not the silence of winter, but the silence of warning. The held breath of the natural world before something it has been anticipating and that it knows, with the certainty of creatures that cannot lie to themselves, is no longer avoidable. Eleanor looked at Toby over breakfast. "We're going to town today," she said. He looked up, said nothing, waited. "I need to warn them again." Still nothing. Then, "They didn't listen before." "No." "Do you think they will this time?" Eleanor considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. Outside, the silence pressed against the cave walls like something with weight. "No," she said honestly, "but I'll sleep better for having tried." Toby ate the rest of his cornmeal, set his bowl down. "I'll come with you," he said. It was not a question. They rode Ghost into town, Toby in front, Eleanor behind, the horse moving with the careful deliberateness of an animal whose leg had healed to something functional, if not quite whole. The valley around them was absolutely still. The trees stood without movement. The creek lay locked beneath gray ice. The sky above held that wrong, bruised, yellow-gray light, the light of a world that has turned its face away from warmth. She had seen sky like that once before, as a child, standing beside her father on a ridge above a different valley. She had been perhaps 6 years old. He had looked at the sky for a long time without speaking. Then he had taken her hand and said simply, "We need to go home now." And they had gone at a pace just short of running, and made it back to their cabin 40 minutes before the storm arrived. She would have given a great deal to be 6 years old again, with her father's hand around hers, running home. The town looked the same as it always had from the outside. The white steeple, the general store, the blacksmith's forge sending its thin thread of smoke into the dead air. People moved along the main street, going about the business of a late autumn morning, and none of them were looking at the sky. Eleanor went first to the general store. The owner, a stocky man named Pratt, who had been one of the louder voices against her at the church meeting, looked up when she entered, and his expression closed, the way a door closes when someone decides a conversation is over before it has begun. "Mrs. Voss, Mr. Pratt." She did not waste time on preamble. "There is a major storm coming, not a regular winter storm, something larger. The signs have been building for weeks, and they are all saying the same thing. You need to move your animals into closed shelter, secure your food stores, and make sure no one is traveling far from their homes in the next 48 hours. Pratt looked at her with the expression of a man who considers patience with unreasonable people to be a form of civic virtue. "Mrs. Voss," he said, with the careful politeness of someone speaking to someone they have decided is unwell. "I appreciate your concern, but we've had a mild autumn. My barns are full. My animals are healthy. And I have been living in this valley for 22 years without needing lessons in preparation from anyone." Eleanor looked at him. "How old are your children?" The question landed oddly. He blinked. "I have a daughter, 7, and a son, 4. Keep them close to the house for the next 2 days. That's all I'm asking." She left before he could respond. The doctor's office was next. Dr. Pemberton Gale received her with the particular brand of courtesy he reserved for people whose intelligence he doubted, but whose social standing required a minimum of surface respect. He listened to her, with his hands folded on his desk and his face arranged in a mask of professional attention that fooled neither of them. When she finished, he said, "The meteorological conditions you're describing are not unprecedented for this time of year. I understand that certain traditional observational methods feel significant, but observation is not prediction. Correlation is not causation. I wouldn't want you to alarm people unnecessarily." "And if I'm right?" Eleanor asked. "If you're right," he said, with the slight smile of a man who does not genuinely entertain the possibility, "then we will deal with it as communities have always dealt with winter weather." She went to 7 more houses, 7 more closed doors. At 2 of them, she was not invited inside at all. At one, a woman she had known for years looked at her through a window and did not come to the door. Toby walked beside her through all of it. He did not react to the closed doors or the polite dismissals or the one house where two older boys on the porch laughed quietly as they walked away. He simply walked, his hand occasionally brushing her arm, not seeking comfort, she understood, but offering it. After the seventh house, he said, "Will they die, Ma? The people who laughed at us?" Eleanor stopped walking. The sky above the street had deepened since morning, the yellow draining out, replaced by a gray so flat and heavy it looked like the underside of something enormous pressing down. Ghost, tied at the edge of the road, had not moved. He stood with every muscle tight, ears pinned forward, staring at nothing visible. She looked at her son. "That's exactly why we're warning them, baby," she said, "so they don't have to." Toby looked at the sky, looked back at her, nodded once with a gravity that made him look, for a brief disorienting moment, nothing like 9 years old. They went to the church last. The meeting was already in session. Word had gotten around, not of the approaching storm, but of Eleanor Voss's presence in town, moving from door to door with her warnings. Reverend Corbin Ashby had called a gathering of the council, which in practice meant a gathering of the men he trusted to agree with him quickly and give the agreement the appearance of collective wisdom. Eleanor walked in without knocking. The room went quiet. 8 men sat around the long table, and at the head of it, Ashby looked up at her with an expression that had evolved since the vote weeks ago. From dismissal into something more complicated, a species of irritation with a thread of something else running through it, something he would not have named if asked. Eleanor did not sit down. "The storm will arrive within 2 days," she said. "Possibly 1. The sky is wrong. The animals know. If you do not begin preparing your households right now, your food, your wood, your livestock, people will not survive what is coming." Silence. Then Harlan Beecham, from his seat to Ashby's right, leaned back in his chair with the ease of a large man who has never been seriously physically afraid of anything. "Mrs. Voss, with respect, my herd is healthy. My barns are solid. My family is warm. I'm not going to turn my household upside down based on the reading of caterpillar coats and beaver constructions." A couple of the other men made sounds of agreement, not loud, comfortable. Reverend Ashby looked at Eleanor with something in his eyes that was almost, not quite, but almost uncertainty. He covered it quickly, the way practiced men cover uncertainty, with the reflexive armor of authority. "Eleanor," he said, "we have discussed this. The community has spoken. I understand that you feel strongly about this, but my responsibility is to prevent panic, not to cause it." "Your responsibility," Eleanor said quietly, "is to the people in this valley. All of them." Ashby met her eyes, held them. And in the space between them, something moved. Something that neither acknowledged and neither looked away from. Then from the doorway behind Eleanor, a voice. "I believe her." The room turned. Martha Ashby stood in the doorway of her husband's church. She had come so quietly that no one had heard the door. She was still wearing her kitchen apron. Her hands were folded in front of her, and her face held an expression Eleanor had never seen on it before. Not the careful blankness of a woman managing invisibility, but something open and irreversible, the face of someone who has crossed a line they did not know existed until they were already on the other side of it. 3 words. The room received them like a stone dropped into still water. Reverend Ashby looked at his wife, and Eleanor, watching, saw the moment, the precise, unmistakable moment, when a man understands that something has changed that cannot be unchanged. His face did not crumple. It simply went still in a different way. The stillness of something that has been load-bearing, discovering that the weight it was meant to carry has shifted elsewhere. He looked at Martha for a long time. Then he waved his hand, the gesture of a man concluding a meeting he no longer has the energy to continue, and said, to no one in particular, "This gathering is adjourned." People filed out. Some of them glanced at Eleanor. Some of them glanced at Martha. Most of them looked at the floor, which is what people do when they are in the presence of something true that they are not yet ready to receive. Martha and Eleanor were briefly side by side in the doorway as the room emptied. They did not speak. Eleanor looked at the older woman, at the apron, the folded hands, the expression that had settled into something between exhaustion and relief, as though a long-carried weight had been set down in the wrong place, but set down nonetheless. Martha met her gaze, did not look away. Eleanor nodded. Once, Martha nodded back. Then they went in opposite directions into the failing afternoon. On the ride back to the cliffs, Toby sat quiet in front of her. Ghost moved steadily beneath them, still tense, still reading the air with every step. The sky had gone fully gray now. Not the gray of cloud cover, but the gray of cessation, as though the light itself had decided to withdraw. Mrs. Ashby stood up, Toby said. She did. A pause. Was she scared? Eleanor considered the question. The wind had begun to move, not strongly, not yet, but from the north, the direction her father had taught her to watch. When the north wind comes cold and steady before snowfall, he had said, it means the system is large. It means there is a great deal of it still coming. I think, Eleanor said slowly, that she's been scared for a long time, and today she decided to be scared and do the right thing anyway. She paused. That's not fearlessness. That's something better. Toby was quiet, absorbing this. The cave received them like a held breath released. Eleanor built the fire high, higher than usual, feeding it with the largest pieces of hardwood she had been saving for exactly this kind of night. Ghost went to his chamber without being led and stood there with his head low and his eyes half closed, conserving what he had. Eleanor checked every alcove, every stored resource with the focused attention of someone running through a checklist they have memorized because the memorizing was the point. She worked until Toby fell asleep. Then she sat alone beside the fire and let the quiet of the cave settle over her. The warmth of the walls, the slow, steady breathing of the horse, the sound of wind beginning to build outside, still distant, still finding its voice. She thought about old Obi's note, about 60 years of silence and a chain of saving she had not known she was part of. About Martha, standing in a doorway in a kitchen apron saying 3 words that had cost her something Eleanor could not fully calculate. She was not angry. She had moved past anger some time ago. What she felt instead was something quieter and more durable, a kind of sorrow, clean and without bitterness, for the difficulty of being human, for the way comfort makes cowards of the most well-intentioned people, for the gap between knowing and acting that had yawned open in that church meeting and swallowed everyone in the room except one old man with a walking stick and, finally, at the last possible moment, one woman in an apron. She pressed her palms flat against the cave wall. The stone was warm. It had been warm for weeks. It had been taking everything she gave it and holding it faithfully, giving nothing back before it was needed, which is the most honest form of generosity there is. She closed her eyes and listened to the wind. It was growing. She could hear it finding its full voice now, not howling, not yet, but speaking clearly in the way that large things speak when they are done with warning and have moved into statement. The kind of sound that does not ask to be believed. The kind that simply arrives and lets the consequences follow. Eleanor opened her eyes, looked at Toby sleeping, looked at Ghost standing steady in the dark of his chamber. She went to the entrance and opened the door a crack and looked out at the night. The snow had begun, not the soft, tentative snow of ordinary winter evenings. This snow fell with purpose, horizontal and driven, the snow of a storm that has made up its mind and is no longer interested in negotiation. Eleanor stood in the narrow opening and felt the cold against her face. Fierce, immediate, the kind of cold that does not suggest but commands. She looked across the valley floor, already dimming under the white building even as she watched, and she thought of all the houses down there with their warm fires and their full barns and their closed doors. She thought of Pratt's daughter, 7 years old. She thought of Harlan Beecham's family. She thought of the woman who had looked at her through a window and not come to the door. She pulled the door closed, barred it, turned back to the fire, to the warmth in the walls, to the sleeping child, and the steady horse, and the 30 spaces she had carved for people who had not asked for them and did not know they were there. She added wood to the fire, and she waited. The first knock came deep in the night. Eleanor was not asleep. She had not tried to sleep. She sat beside the fire with her back against the warm stone and her hands folded in her lap, and listened to the storm do what she had known it would do, build and build and build, finding new registers of sound as the hours passed, moving from statement into something that felt almost personal, the way very large things sometimes feel personal when you are small enough to be inside them. Ghost had not moved from the entrance to his chamber. He stood with his head low and his ears flat, and his whole body held in the careful stillness of an animal that has decided the wisest response to what it cannot control is simply to endure. Toby slept. Eleanor had watched him for a long time before stopping. The watching of a mother who needs to confirm again and again that the most important thing is still all right. His breathing was slow and even. One hand was tucked under his chin. The other rested against Ghost's foreleg, where it had drifted in the night. The knock, when it came, was small, almost apologetic. Eleanor was at the door before the second knock landed. She lifted the bar, pulled the door inward. Ridley Crane stood in the entrance, snow thick on his shoulders and in his hair, ice forming at his eyelashes. He was holding something bundled against his chest, something wrapped in his own coat, pressed tight against the warmth of his body. His face was the face of someone who has been doing something very difficult for a very long time, and has not yet allowed himself to feel how difficult it was. "It's Willa Dodd's baby," he said. His voice was rough with cold. "Her husband went out 2 hours ago to secure the animals and didn't come back. She sent me. She couldn't leave the other children." He swallowed. "I carried the little one. She was the coldest." Eleanor stepped back and held the door wide. He came in and stood close to the fire and carefully, with hands that were shaking now that they had permission to shake, unwrapped the bundle. The baby was perhaps 8 months old, round-faced and pale, her lips slightly blue at the edges. She was breathing. Eleanor checked first before anything else, but the breath was shallow and the small body was cold in a way that spoke of hours, not minutes. Eleanor took her directly. She had learned what she knew about cold and recovery from her father, who had learned it from his, who had learned it from men who spent long months in places where the margin between alive and not alive was measured in degrees and minutes. She held the baby against her own chest, using her body heat as the most reliable warmth available. And she moved, rocking slightly, the unconscious rocking of women with cold children that requires no instruction because it is older than instruction. Behind her, Toby's voice came from across the cave, sleep rough and alert at the same moment. "Who's here?" "Ridley," Eleanor said, "and a baby who needs warming. Come help." There was no pause. Toby was beside her within seconds, fully awake in the way children who have lived close to necessity learn to become fully awake. Completely, immediately, without the gradual assembly of consciousness that safety allows. He looked at the baby, looked at his mother. "What do I do?" "Sit here. Hold your hands close to her feet, not touching yet, just close. Let your warmth move toward her slowly. Too fast is also wrong." He sat. He held his hands as directed. He did not ask questions. The second knock came perhaps an hour later. Then the third. Then, over the next several hours, the knocks came in a rhythm that was not regular but was relentless. The rhythm of people reaching the end of what they could endure and finding, at the end of it, a door. The Pratt family came through in the second hour. Pratt himself, who had looked at Eleanor in his general store with the condescension of a man who has confused duration of residence with depth of knowledge, came through the door carrying his daughter on his back, the 7-year-old whose age Eleanor had made him speak aloud that afternoon. The girl's face was buried in her father's shoulder. When he set her down near the fire, she looked up and around the cave with enormous eyes, and whatever she saw there, the warmth, the light, the horse's silver flank visible in the adjoining chamber, made something in her face relax in a way that had nothing to do with thought and everything to do with the body finally believing it was safe. Pratt looked at Eleanor. He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. "My roof," he started. "It doesn't matter," Eleanor said. "Sit down. Get warm." He sat. He did not speak again for a long time. The Gale family came next. Dr. Pemberton Gale, who had cited barometric patterns and distinguished correlation from causation with the ease of a man for whom education had always been the final word on any subject, arrived at the cave with his wife pressed close against his side, and a look on his face Eleanor had not seen there before. The look of a man who has been wrong in a way that has consequences, and who is still in the early, disorienting stages of understanding what that means. He stood in the entrance after his wife had gone to the fire, and he looked at Eleanor directly. "I told 4 families today that your concerns were not scientifically grounded," he said. His voice was level, but stripped of everything it usually carried. The authority, the precision, the slight elevation that expertise had given it for so many years. 3 of those families are not here. Eleanor looked at him. "Are they sheltered?" "I believe so. The Hendersons have a stone cellar. The Marshalls—" He paused. "I don't know about the Marshalls." Eleanor nodded. "We'll check when it breaks." She moved to step past him, back into the business of the cave. Gale's hand came up, stopping just short of her arm. Mrs. Voss. The weight of something being assembled from parts that did not fit easily together. I had years of formal education. You had a father who taught you to listen. You knew more than I did. And I made it impossible for people to hear you. I am... He stopped, started again. I don't have adequate words for what I am. Eleanor looked at him for a moment. Then help me now, she said. There's a baby with shallow breathing in the back corner. Tell me if there's anything medically I should be doing differently. He straightened. Purpose reorganized itself in his face. Yes, he said. Show me. Harlan Beecham came last of all. He came alone. He came without his coat. He had given it to someone on the way, Eleanor would learn later. A detail no one who knew Harlan Beecham before that night would have predicted. He stood in the entrance of the cave, and the snow fell off him in clumps, and he looked at Eleanor Voss in the way a man looks at something he has fundamentally misjudged when the evidence has become impossible to look away from. He was a large man. He had always seemed large. Large in presence, large in certainty, large in the space he took up in any room he entered. Standing in Eleanor's doorway, he did not seem large. He seemed like a man standing in a doorway. He said nothing. Eleanor stepped aside. He came in, sat down heavily on the stone bench along the wall, the bench she had carved herself, smoothed by weeks of her own sitting. He put his big hands on his knees and stared at the fire, and did not speak for a very long time. Toby appeared at Eleanor's elbow. He looked at Beecham, looked at his mother. Then he crossed the cave, picked up a bowl of broth Eleanor had been keeping warm at the edge of the fire, and carried it to the large man on the bench. Beecham looked at the bowl, looked at the boy. "Thank you," he said. His voice came out strange, compressed, effortful, the voice of a man managing something large in a small space. Toby nodded and went back to the baby. The cave held 23 people through that first long night. Eleanor did not sleep. She moved. She organized. The sleeping spaces she had prepared over the previous weeks. The stored food distributed in careful portions that accounted for the duration of what was coming. The firewood rotated so the oldest and driest pieces fed the main fire, while the green wood was stacked to dry for the days ahead. She checked the baby every hour. She showed 3 of the women how to use the alcove she had packed with herbs, what to brew for fever, what to press against a cold chest, what to give children who could not sleep. She showed Pratt's daughter how to feed Ghost. This was not strictly necessary. The girl needed instruction. She was nervous of the horse's size. It took time that Eleanor could have used for other things. But there was something in the child's face when she approached Ghost with a handful of dried grass, and the horse lowered his great head and accepted it from her palm. Something that opened like a window in a room that has been closed too long. And Eleanor, watching from across the cave, thought, that is worth the time. That is worth any amount of time. Martha arrives. It was past the deepest part of the night when Martha Ashby arrived. She came quietly, as she did everything. A knock so careful it was barely a knock. And then she was inside, snow on her shoulders, an expression on her face that had moved past the complicated into something simpler and more final. She was carrying a cloth bag pressed against her chest. Her husband was not with her. Eleanor did not ask. She simply looked at Martha, and Martha looked back, and in the look was everything. The church meeting, the years of silence, the 3 words in the doorway, the night that had followed. He stayed, Martha said, 2 words, quiet and complete. Eleanor nodded. Martha came fully inside. She looked around the cave, at the people sleeping in the spaces Eleanor had carved for them, at the fire burning steady and warm, at Toby sitting cross-legged near the baby with Ghost standing close behind him like a wall the boy had not built, but had been given. She looked for a long time. Then she reached into the cloth bag and began to set things down. Dried beans, a tin of salt pork, flour wrapped carefully in oilcloth against the moisture, preserved fruit in small sealed jars, 6 of them, the kind of careful preservation that takes hours, and the knowledge of how to seal correctly against spoilage, hard cheese wrapped in cloth, a bundle of dried herbs tied with string. She set each thing down without comment, without drama, without looking at anyone, just placed each item in the storage alcove Eleanor had designated for provisions, fitting the pieces together with the practiced ease of a woman who has spent years understanding how to make a kitchen work. The total was more than Eleanor had expected, much more. Martha had been gathering for months, a little here, a little there, tucked behind shelves her husband never opened, in corners of the pantry he never looked into. She had not known, when she started, exactly what she was preparing for. She had only known that something was required of her, and that this was the one action within her reach. The provisions she brought extended what Eleanor had stored by nearly 2 weeks. Eleanor looked at what had been set down, looked at Martha. Martha finally looked back. Her face was the face of someone who has spent a very long time being invisible, and is only now, in this moment, allowing herself to be seen. It was not a comfortable face. It was not a face that had arrived at ease easily or recently, but it was honest, completely, finally, almost painfully honest. "I knew," Martha said, without excuse. "That night in the church, I knew you were right. I've known it every day since." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. "Why?" she said, not accusatory, genuinely asking. Because she had wondered, in the long nights, in the silent working hours, in the moments when the hurt of that evening moved through her, she had genuinely wondered what it cost a person to know the truth and choose silence. Martha folded her hands, looked at them. "Because standing up felt too large," she said. "Because I had spent 20 years making myself small enough to fit inside my life, and standing up would have meant admitting that the life I'd made myself fit into was the wrong shape." A pause. "And because I was afraid." She looked up, met Eleanor's eyes directly. "I'm not afraid tonight." Eleanor looked at this woman, this careful, invisible woman who had tucked provisions into corners for months without being asked, who had stood in a doorway in a kitchen apron and said 3 words that had cost her everything she knew, who had walked through a storm to a cave carved into a cliff by someone the town had voted to erase. "No," Eleanor said quietly. "Neither am I." Healing in the dark. In the hours before dawn, the cave became its own country. 23 people in a space carved from red sandstone, sharing warmth that had been built into the walls over weeks by a woman working alone, breathing the same air, sleeping in the spaces that same woman had prepared without being asked and without expecting thanks. Children who had never met each other slept curled together under shared blankets. Adults who had been neighbors for years without truly knowing each other found themselves side by side in the dark, and the dark was an equalizer. It asked nothing about who had been right and who had been wrong. It only asked, "Are you warm? Are you breathing? Is the person beside you still alive? These were, it turned out, the only questions that had always mattered. Willa Dodd sat in a corner of the cave, wrapped in a blanket someone had given her, and she did not speak, and she did not eat, and she held herself with the stillness of a woman who has received news she has not yet found a way to carry. Eleanor came and sat beside her, not with words, not with the well-intentioned offerings of comfort that are so often about the giver's discomfort rather than the receiver's grief. She simply sat. She placed her hand over Willa's, and she was there, and she stayed there, and she did not ask anything of Willa at all. Sometimes presence is the whole of what is needed. Eleanor had learned this from her father, who had learned it from the mountains, which are present without commentary, which witness without judgment, which remain when everything else has gone. After a long time, Willa's hand turned beneath Eleanor's and held it. That was all, but it was enough. In the small hours, the baby's color changed. Eleanor was there when it happened. She had been checking every hour through the night, and she saw the blue leave the baby's lips and the natural warmth return to the small round cheeks, degree by degree, the way warmth always returns, slowly, steadily, without announcement. The breathing deepened. The tiny fists unclenched. Toby had fallen asleep sitting up against Ghost's foreleg, his hand still resting near the baby in the instinctive proximity of someone who has been keeping watch. He woke when Eleanor made a small sound. Not a word, barely a sound, the involuntary exhale of relief. And he looked at the baby and then looked at his mother with questions in his eyes. "She's better," Eleanor said. Toby looked at the baby for a long moment, at the color in her face, at the even rise and fall of the small chest. "Ma," he said. His voice was very quiet. "I did it." Eleanor looked at her son, 9 years old, sitting on the stone floor of a cave he had helped build. In the middle of a night he had moved through without complaint, having kept watch over a stranger's child until the danger passed. "Yes," she said, "you did." She sat down beside him. He leaned against her without saying anything more, and she put her arm around him. And they sat together in the warmth of the cave and listened to 22 other people breathe. Outside, the storm said everything it had been building toward. Inside, the stone remembered every fire that had ever been asked of it, and Eleanor Voss sat with her son in the warmth she had made from nothing, and understood, for the first time with her whole self, not just the thinking part, but the deep, wordless part that her father had always been trying to reach. That this was what the knowledge was for. Not for her survival alone, not for vindication, not to be right when others were wrong. It was for this. For a baby breathing easier in the dark. For a frightened child feeding a horse at midnight. For a woman setting provisions down without being asked. For 23 people sleeping in spaces that had been prepared for them by someone they had wronged, in a warmth they had not earned, under a roof that forgiveness had made possible. This was what her father had been giving her all those years. Not just the knowledge of how to survive, the knowledge of what survival was for. Later, when the fire had burned low and everyone else was sleeping, Eleanor sat alone beside the coals. Ghost breathed steadily in his chamber. Toby was asleep against the wall, one hand loosely curled near where the baby lay warm and quiet in a nest of blankets. Eleanor reached into her coat and drew out the strip of cloth that remained from Edmund's lining, the piece she had not used on the wolf, worn soft from weeks of being carried against her chest. She held it in both hands, not clutching, just holding. "We made it," she said quietly, "to the coals, to the warm stone, to the dark. Toby and I, we made it through." What was true was this: the cave was warm. 23 people breathed inside it. A baby who had been blue at the edges was now pink and sleeping. Her son, who had gone quiet after his father died, had spoken with his father's voice tonight when he opened the door. She folded the cloth carefully, placed it back against her chest. "He sounds like you," she said. "When he says the right thing, he sounds exactly like you." Eleanor pressed her palm flat against the wall, still warm, still faithful, still giving back everything it had been given, slowly, without being asked. Stone remembers warmth. She closed her eyes, and for the first time in 2 years, the word that came to her was not loss, not grief, not absence, not the long, hollow ache of a life with something essential removed. The word that came to her was carried. She had been carrying him all along, in the knowledge he had trusted her with, in the son he had given her, in every fire she had built in this cave, each one absorbed into the stone, held, transformed into warmth that reached other people on a night they could not have survived alone. She sat with this for a long time. Then she added one last piece of wood to the fire, settled herself against the warm wall, and let her eyes close. For the first time in a very long time, she slept. The storm broke on the 4th day. It did not end dramatically. It did not announce its conclusion the way it had announced its arrival. With force, with intention, with the overwhelming certainty of something that has made up its mind. It simply diminished hour by hour, the wind losing its voice gradually, the snow slowing from horizontal assault to vertical drift, to the occasional wandering flake that seemed almost apologetic after what had preceded it. And then, sometime in the early morning of the 4th day, Eleanor opened the cave door, and the world outside was still white, utterly, completely white. The valley had been remade. The familiar shapes, the tree line, the creek bank, the trail that wound down toward the settlement, were all present but altered, softened, buried to depths that made the world look like a different version of itself. The sky above was the pale, exhausted blue of something that has spent everything it had and is now simply resting. Eleanor stood in the doorway for a long time. Behind her, the cave held its warmth and its 23 people and its accumulated days of shared breath and proximity and the intimacy that only difficulty produces. People were beginning to stir. Someone had added wood to the fire. The smell of broth heating moved through the connected chambers, and Ghost shifted in his stable and blew a long, considering breath. And somewhere near the back, a child made the small complaining sound of a child who is waking up and not yet sure where it is. Normal sounds, living sounds. Eleanor breathed the cold air and let it fill her lungs completely, and felt something in her chest that she had been carrying for months. The compressed, braced quality of someone permanently prepared for the next difficulty. Begin very slowly to release. It was not over. The snow was deep and the cold remained, and there would be hard days of recovery ahead, for the valley and the people in it and the structures that had not survived. It was not over, but the worst of it had passed, and they were all still here. What would you have done in her place? If you had known, and no one had listened, and then they came to your door. Would you have opened it? The search parties went out that first morning. Men from the cave moving in pairs through the deep snow, checking the houses and families who had sheltered in place. Most had survived. The stone cellars and the solidly built structures had held. There were injuries, frostbite in several cases, and one man who had broken his arm falling from a barn roof in the early hours of the storm. Dr. Pemberton Gale moved between cases with a focused efficiency that had been stripped of all its former performance, all its careful positioning of expertise. He was simply a doctor doing what doctors do. It suited him considerably better than what he had been before. The Reverend's church was found intact. The Reverend was found inside it. Eleanor was not part of the search party that went to the church. She heard about it from Ridley Crane, who came back to the cave in the mid-morning with snow to his knees and an expression on his young face that was working very hard to carry more than 17 years could comfortably hold. Reverend Corbin Ashby had been found in the front pew. He was sitting upright, his hands folded in his lap, his head slightly bowed, as though he had fallen asleep in the middle of something he had intended to finish. His coat was around his shoulders. His Bible was in the crook of his arm, held there with the deliberateness of a man who has decided that if he is going to remain somewhere, he will remain with the thing he most believes in. He had not died of cold. The church, well built and tightly sealed, had retained enough warmth for survival. He had died of hunger. Over the 4 days of the storm, with provisions available in the church's small back room, Reverend Corbin Ashby had eaten almost nothing. He had refused, in the end, every form of sustenance that required him to admit that the world had turned out differently than he had declared it would. Eleanor stood at the church door later that day and looked in from the threshold. She did not go inside. She looked at the empty pew, at the place where a man had sat and made his final choice with the same absolute certainty that had governed every other choice he had made. And then she saw it. His coat, folded on the armrest beside where he had sat, folded with the same careful precision he had brought to everything, to his sermons, his judgments, his sense of himself as a man of order and righteousness. Folded neatly even at the end, even alone, even in the dark when there was no one left to see. The coat told her something about him that no sermon ever had, that even in his last hours he had maintained the forms. He had kept the shape of the life he believed in, long after the life itself had gone quiet. She had expected something when she stood at that threshold, some release, perhaps, some easing of the long months of pressure. What she found instead was grief, not for herself, not for the weeks of exile and the cold and the fear and the nights alone in a cave talking to stone walls. She felt grief for him, for the man he had been before certainty hardened into something that could no longer bend, for the door that had been left open for him and that he had chosen, in the end, not to walk through. He was not a monster. Eleanor had never thought he was a monster. He was a cautionary tale, and cautionary tales are always, at their root, tragedies. Martha Ashby received the news sitting on the stone bench along the cave wall, her hands folded in her lap. Eleanor sat beside her. Neither spoke for a long while. The fire crackled in its pit. Ghost shifted in his chamber. Outside, someone was calling to someone else across the snow. A normal human sound, the sound of people who have survived something and are beginning, cautiously, to believe it. He was good once, Martha said finally. Her voice was level, the voice of a woman who has had time, over years of quiet attention, to understand the person she is speaking about. before the certainty took him, before he stopped being able to hear anything except himself. She was quiet for a moment. I used to think that if I were patient enough, he would find his way back, that there was a door inside him that was still unlocked. A pause, long. There wasn't. Or if there was, he'd lost the key so long ago he'd forgotten it ever existed. Eleanor said nothing. She understood that this was not a statement requiring response. It was a woman sorting through the debris of a long marriage, holding each piece up to the light and deciding quietly what it was worth. I stayed too long, Martha said. I knew it, and I stayed anyway, because leaving felt like admitting that I'd wasted something I couldn't get back. She looked at Eleanor. Staying was the real waste. I understand that now. You're here, Eleanor said. Yes. Martha looked around the cave, at the carved walls, the warm stone, the carefully arranged stores that had seen 23 people through 4 days of extremity. I am. She straightened slightly on the bench. The expression that settled on her face was not happiness exactly. Something older and more durable than happiness. The face of a woman who has finally, after a very long detour, arrived somewhere true. What will you do? Eleanor asked. Stay useful, she said. Teach what I know. Start from where I am. I spent 20 years making myself small enough to fit inside my life. I'd like to spend whatever time remains being visible in someone else's. The reckoning, the settling of accounts in the days that followed, came not as ceremony, but as accumulation. The slow, honest process that happens when extreme circumstances have stripped away the social courtesies that usually allow people to avoid looking directly at what they have done. Harland Beecham came to Eleanor on the second morning after the storm broke. He found her shoring up the eastern chamber entrance, working with the methodical focus that had become her default mode over the long winter months. He stood and watched for a moment before she turned. She let him stand there because she could hear from the quality of his presence that he was building towards something that needed to be built carefully. I lost everything, he said, not complaining, reporting. The herd, 4 years of work, animals I raised from calves. He turned his hat in his hands. I stood in that store and I laughed. I sat in that council room and I waved your words away like smoke. He looked at her. My daughter was in the house when the second barn roof came down. She wasn't hurt. But if my wife hadn't brought the children inside early, he stopped, the hat turned. If she hadn't heard something in what you said, even through me laughing it off. Your wife was listening, Eleanor said. The credit belongs to her. Yes. He said it simply, without deflection. It does. And I told her so this morning for the first time in our marriage in the way it needed to be told. He held out his hand. I don't know that I deserve anything from you, but I wanted you to know that I understand what I did, and that I won't do it again. Eleanor looked at his hand, at the man behind it, reduced, honest, present in a way he had never been in all the years she had known him as a neighbor. She took his hand. Then rebuild, she said, and listen differently this time. He nodded, held the handshake for one honest moment. Then, before he let go, he said one more thing. The coat. He looked at the floor briefly, then back at her. The night of the storm, coming here. There was a woman on the road, Mrs. Pratt's sister. She'd been caught out visiting. She had 2 children with her, no coats to speak of. Her youngest wasn't moving right. He paused. I gave her my coat, wrapped the little one in it. They made it to the Hendersons' cellar. A pause. I need you to know that, because someone told you I came without a coat, and I don't want you thinking it was... I don't know what I want you to think. I just wanted you to know what happened to it. Eleanor looked at him, at the man who had laughed loudest at her warning and had then, in the dark of the worst storm in living memory, given a child his coat and walked the rest of the way to her door in the cold. I know what happened to it, she said quietly, and I'm glad you told me. He nodded, let go of her hand, and walked back down through the snow toward whatever came next. Dr. Gale came to her on the third day, carrying his medical bag with a deliberateness that had the quality of a statement. He had been moving through the valley since the morning the storm broke, treating frostbite and injury and the various physical consequences of 4 days of extreme cold. He had not stopped. Eleanor had heard this from 6 different people, and each time she had thought, good, that is the right currency for this particular debt. I want to talk about what you have here, he said, looking around the cave with the eyes of someone finally looking at something they have spent months refusing to see. The thermal properties, the way you've used the stone, the ventilation. He paused. And I want to talk about what you know that I don't. Eleanor waited. I have been practicing medicine in this valley for 11 years, he said. In that time, I have positioned myself as the authority on all matters that touched on science, on what can be known, and how it can be known. He was quiet for a moment. You had knowledge I dismissed as superstition. It was not superstition. It was a different methodology. Older, observational, accumulated over generations rather than extracted in controlled conditions. No less valid. In the respects that mattered most, more valid. Because it was right. And I was wrong. And people suffered for the difference. Eleanor said nothing. She let the words stand without softening them, because they were true, and they had been earned, and they deserved to stand undiminished. I would like to use whatever influence I have remaining, Gale continued, to support what you're doing here, the teaching, the knowledge. He met her eyes. I cannot give back the weeks when I helped silence you, but I can spend the years ahead making certain that the next person who stands up and says something true is not silenced the same way. Eleanor looked at this man, at 11 years of careful authority, dismantled in 4 days of storm, at the face of someone who has been genuinely changed by what he has witnessed and is trying to figure out what to do with the changed version of himself. Come back tomorrow, she said. I'll show you how to read the beaver dams. Something shifted in his expression, not quite a smile, but the thing that comes before one. I'll be here, he said. Willa Dodd came to Eleanor quietly, on a gray afternoon when the snow had begun to settle. She was younger than Eleanor by nearly a decade, with the composure of someone who has received terrible news and chosen, in the absence of alternatives, to simply keep moving. Her husband had not come back from trying to secure the animals. He had been found 2 days after the storm broke in the lee of the collapsed barn, where he had taken shelter when the weather made returning to the house impossible. He had not survived the night. Willa sat with Eleanor beside the fire, and Eleanor sat with her the same way she had sat through the storm night, present, quiet, not trying to fix what was not fixable. I don't know how you did it, Willa said after a long silence. After Edmund, alone with Toby, I don't know how you kept going. I didn't always know I was doing it, Eleanor said finally. Some days I just did the next thing, and the next thing after that. And eventually, enough next things had accumulated that it had started to look like a life. Willa was quiet. Is that what it becomes? Eventually? Yes, Eleanor said. It doesn't stop hurting, but it becomes something you carry instead of something that carries you. Willa looked at the baby, her daughter, warm and thriving now, sitting in the curve of Toby's arm while the boy read to her from the small book Martha had produced from her storm bag. Something in Willa's face shifted. The movement of a person who has been carrying only grief and has just noticed there is also something else worth carrying. I named her after your father, Willa said. Thomasine. It felt right, like acknowledgement of the chain. Eleanor looked at the baby, at the round face, the dark eyes blinking at the world with the untroubled attention of someone who has not yet learned to be afraid of it. Thomasine, she said quietly. Is that all right? Eleanor felt something move through her chest. That sensation she had no clean name for, that lived in the space between grief and gratitude, between the things that end and the things that do not. Yes, she said. It's more than all right. The season turned slowly from winter toward something that would eventually become spring, and with the turning came the work of rebuilding. Not just the physical structures, but the more complicated architecture of a community that has looked at itself clearly and must now decide what to do with what it has seen. Eleanor taught anyone who came to her. She taught them to read the signs, the beaver dams and the caterpillar coats, the behavior of birds, and the quality of light on the ridge at specific times of day. She walked people through the valley and pointed at what had always been visible and explained what it meant. Most people, once they were given the language, were perfectly capable of reading it. They had simply never been taught to try. She taught thermal mass, the principle that had saved her life on the night the fire went out. She showed builders how to incorporate stone into their construction in ways that would hold warmth through the worst that winter could offer. Gale stood beside her at several of these explanations and contributed whatever his own knowledge could add, and the combination of their two very different kinds of learning created something that neither could have produced alone. Ridley Crane was her most devoted student. He came to the cave on most days and worked beside Eleanor with the focused seriousness of someone who understands that what he is receiving is not just information, but inheritance. One afternoon, as they were reading the Beaver Dam on the North Creek together, Ridley said, "My grandfather always said the old ways were backward. That education meant leaving them behind." Eleanor looked at the dam, the careful architecture of it, the accumulated intelligence of countless generations of animals that had survived precisely because they paid attention. "Education that makes you deaf," she said, "is not education. It's just a different kind of ignorance wearing fancier clothes." Ridley looked at the dam for a long time. Then he nodded slowly, the nod of someone filing something away for good. Martha Ashby taught the children to read. It had begun without formal arrangement. 3 restless children, a small book, an afternoon that needed filling. By the time the snow was thinning at the edges, Martha had a group of 11 children who came to the cave 3 mornings a week and sat in the warmth of the carved chambers and learned to make sense of marks on a page. She was a remarkably good teacher, patient without being passive, demanding without being harsh, with the quality of attention that children recognize and respond to. She had spent 20 years performing the role of the Reverend's wife. This was not a performance. This was Martha Ashby, finally, without the costume. Old DOBE's gift. Old Obadiah Whitfield died before the last snow melted. Caleb brought the news and a small bundle tied with string. An arrowhead, old and carefully worked, wrapped in cloth. With a note in the unsteady hand Eleanor had come to know over the winter months. Your father gave me this the day he carried me home through the snow. He said it was older than both of us, and it was meant to go forward. He said his father had given it to him, and his father's father before that, and that no one could remember where it had started, only that it had always been passed to the person who most needed to carry it next. I kept it 60 years because I didn't know who to give it to. Now I do. Give it to Toby when he is ready. Tell him the chain does not break unless someone lets it. Eleanor sat with the arrowhead in her palm for a long time. It was small, dark flint, worked smooth on the edges, the kind of object that accumulates meaning the way stone accumulates warmth. Slowly, over long exposure, without drama. She thought about an 8-year-old boy lost in snow, and a man who found him by following ravens, and 60 years of silence held like a stone in a chest. She wrapped the arrowhead back in its cloth, placed it in her coat pocket beside old Obie's letter, beside the folded note she had carried since the first week in the cave, against her chest where she kept the things that mattered. She would know when Toby was ready. She had her father's eyes for that kind of thing. Ghost died on a morning in early summer, several seasons after the great storm. He had been slowing for a while, the long, gradual slowing of an animal that has lived well and given what it had to give and arrived, without drama, at the end of things. He lay down in the sun near the entrance to his chamber on a morning when the air was warm and the light came through the cave entrance at the low, golden angle that means the season has finally turned, and he did not rise again. Toby sat with him first. Eleanor found them there, her son, taller now, with Edmund's hands and something in the set of his face that was entirely his own, sitting cross-legged on the stone floor with his palm flat against Ghost's neck. Eleanor sat down on the other side without speaking. They simply sat with Ghost through the morning and into the afternoon, present in the way the horse had always been present for them, without condition, without demand, simply there. The heartbeat under Toby's hand slowed and then stilled. The silence that followed was different from other silences. It had weight and texture. It was the silence of an ending that had been preceded by a great deal of living, which is the only kind of ending worth having. He carried us, Toby said finally. His voice was steady, but barely. He did. He didn't have to. No, Eleanor said. He chose to. That's different from having to. They buried Ghost beside the cave entrance, in ground that had softened with the season. Toby used the old hunting knife to carve the letters into the sandstone face, slowly and carefully, the way Eleanor had taught him to work stone, not fighting it, following the lines the rock wanted to give. When he finished, he stepped back and read what he had written. Ghost. He carried us when we had nothing left to carry ourselves. They stood before the stone together for a while. The summer air moved warm around them. Below in the valley, the settlement showed the changes of the years since the storm. New construction, built differently now, with stone incorporated into the walls the way Eleanor had taught. structures designed to hold warmth rather than simply to enclose it. Toby put his arm around his mother's shoulders. He was taller than her now by several inches. She let herself lean into him slightly, accepted the steadiness his height offered. They stood there until the light changed. The cave endured through the years. It was added to, expanded, improved by hands other than Eleanor's. Toby contributed a proper framed entrance. Ridley added a secondary ventilation system. Other students contributed improvements Eleanor had not thought of herself, which pleased her in a way she could not quite articulate. The knowledge growing and changing in other hands was exactly how it was supposed to work, but the original chamber, the one Eleanor had carved herself with a hunting knife and a borrowed hammerstone in a race against the first killing frost, remained as it had always been, warm, honest, shaped by the natural lines of the rock rather than imposed upon them. The fire pit in its original position, the alcoves where she had stored the first provisions, the bench along the near wall, smooth from years of use, shaped to the contour of a person who spent a great deal of time sitting and thinking and doing the quiet, necessary work of deciding who she was going to be. People came to the cave for teaching, for shelter in hard seasons, for the comfort of a place that has been used for good purposes long enough to hold some residue of those purposes in its walls. Children born after the great storm grew up knowing the cave the way they knew the creek and the ridge and the particular angle of the mountain against the winter sky, as a fixed point, a given, a kind of promise. Above the entrance, in letters that seasons had worn but not erased, the inscription remained. The mountain told me, I told them, now we all know. Visitors read it and asked about it, and the asking led to the telling. And the telling kept the story alive the way stories must be kept alive. Not preserved in amber, not locked in a box, but spoken aloud to someone who had not heard it before, carried forward in the only vehicle that has ever worked, one human voice, one attentive listener, and the willingness to say what is true, even when the room is not yet ready to hear it. Eleanor grows old. Eleanor grew old in the way of women who have spent their lives doing real things, not quickly, not easily, but with a kind of solidity, as though the work had been building something in her that could not be easily diminished. Her hair went white by degrees. Her hands, already mapped with decades of use, accumulated new geography. She moved more slowly, and she allowed the slower pace without resistance, the way she had always allowed the rock to tell her where it wanted to give. She watched Toby become the man she had always suspected he was going to be, a builder and a teacher, quiet and attentive and guided by what was actually true rather than what was convenient to believe. She watched Ridley Crane build the school he had always been building in his mind. She watched Martha Ashby teach 3 generations of Valley children to read, and watched something in Martha's face change over those years from the relief of escaped confinement into the settled warmth of a person who has found, finally, what she was supposed to be doing. She had given Toby the arrowhead on the morning of his 21st birthday. She had told him the story of old Obie and of Thomas Harrow carrying a small boy through the snow, and of 60 years of silence, and of the note written in an unsteady hand that had made her understand for the first time that she was not the beginning of anything, but somewhere in the middle of something very long. Toby had held the arrowhead in his palm the same way she had, for a long time, turning it, feeling the worked edges, the weight of it. Then he had wrapped it carefully in its cloth, and placed it in his own coat pocket. "When will I know who to give it to?" he asked. "You'll know," Eleanor said. "It finds its own way forward. You just have to be paying attention." On an autumn afternoon, many years after the great storm, Toby's daughter came to the cave. She was a serious child, 7, perhaps 8, with Eleanor's gray eyes reproduced so exactly that looking at her was like looking at something returned from a very long journey. She pressed her palms flat against the cave wall the way Eleanor had always done, and her expression shifted into genuine surprise. "Grandma," she said, "the stone is warm." Eleanor was sitting in the low chair Toby had built for her, placed just inside the entrance where the afternoon light came in sideways and lay across the floor in long, warm strips. "Yes," Eleanor said. "Why is it still warm?" "The fire is small." "Because stone remembers," Eleanor said. "Every fire that was ever built in this place, the rock absorbed the heat and kept it. It doesn't give it back all at once. It gives it back slowly, steadily, long after the flames are gone." The girl considered this. Who built the first fire here? Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Outside, the autumn light lay across the valley in long golden sheets, and the mountain rose beyond it the way it always had. Patient, enormous, utterly honest about what was coming and what was not. "Your great-great-grandfather knew this place," Eleanor said. "He taught me about it. His father had taught him. And someone before that, further back than any of us can trace. I built the first fire in this particular cave, but I only knew how because of everyone who came before me." The girl looked at the walls, at the inscription above the door, worn by seasons but still legible, at the grave marker visible through the entrance. "Who is Ghost?" she asked, so Eleanor told her. About the horse that had appeared from the winter mist with his injured leg and hollow ribs, and eyes full of the wariness of something that has learned trust is expensive. About the 9 days of patient approach, dried grass on a flat rock, the retreat, the waiting. About the morning the horse walked forward on his own, and the warm breath against an outstretched hand, and the words spoken quietly in the cold, were the same, left behind, but still here. About the night a baby's color returned, and Toby's hand resting on that gray neck, and the summer morning when they had sat with him until the heartbeat stilled. The girl listened without interrupting. When Eleanor finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "Will you teach me?" she said. "How to read the signs, how to know what the mountain knows." Eleanor looked at her granddaughter, at the gray eyes given back to her across the distance of generations, at the open, serious face of someone who is ready to receive what is being offered, not because she has been told to want it, but because something in her already knows. The afternoon light moved across the warm stone floor. The mountain stood where it had always stood. "Yes," Eleanor said. "Sit down. We'll start today." The girl sat cross-legged on the cave floor, her hands in her lap, her face turned toward the entrance, and the world beyond it. The valley, the ridge, the mountain, the sky that told its slow and patient truth to anyone willing to learn its language. Eleanor began. "The earth never lies, the earth never lies." It had not lied to Thomas Harrow, who had followed ravens through the snow and carried a small boy home on his back and said nothing about it to anyone, because he understood that the act of saving must be repeated, that knowledge given is knowledge multiplied, that what he carried in his hands and his memory was not his alone. It had not lied to old Obadiah Whitfield, who had kept a secret for 60 years and given it away at precisely the right moment. Understanding that the things we hold too long become burdens, and the things we give away become gifts. And the difference between holding and giving is often just the courage to open the hand. It had not lied to Eleanor Voss, who had stood alone before a room full of people and said what she knew to be true and paid the price for saying it. In exile, in cold, in the long, lonely months of building something from nothing, and had been proven right in the most expensive way possible. It would not lie to this child either. Not if she learned to listen. Not if she kept the fire burning. Not if she understood, as Eleanor had come to understand, that knowledge is not a possession. It is a chain. And a chain is only as strong as the willingness of each person in it to hold on and to pass forward and to trust that the next hand is ready to receive. The chain does not break unless someone lets it. Eleanor looked at her granddaughter, sitting cross-legged on the warm stone floor with her hands in her lap and her face turned toward the mountain, ready. If you are facing your own winter right now, if you are sitting somewhere quiet, wondering whether what you know is worth saying, whether the people around you are ready to hear it, remember her. Remember that she was 38 years old and widowed and afraid, and they voted her out into the cold. Remember that she built a fire anyway, and the stone remembered, the earth never lies. And neither did she. The mountain told me. I told them. Now we all know. This is a work of fiction. All characters, events, and locations depicted in this story are entirely imaginary and exist solely within the narrative. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or deceased, or to real events or places, is entirely coincidental and unintended.